They belittled her, sidelined her, and disguised their contempt with corporate smiles. Then told her that her tone was too sharp, her presence too loud, and her skin too distracting for the company's image. She wasn't overlooked by accident. She was targeted with precision. Dressed in excellence, armed with credentials, she walked into that room prepared to lead, but they already had a role in mind. Invisible. Every smirk, every whispered remark, every polished insult masked a deeper truth they didn't realize they were writing into history. Because what they didn't ask, what they never imagined, was who she really was, and how much power sat quietly in her silence. This isn't a redemption arc. This is a reckoning. Before we show you how one woman turned their entire empire upside down without raising her voice, tell us, where are you watching from? What would you have done in her place? Like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments. This story doesn't just demand your attention. It earns it. The boardroom at Revell Corporation gleamed in polished marble and chrome, a glass box in the sky that reeked of power and hierarchy. Inside, the air hung heavy with the morning scent of espresso and competition. Executives filed in with well-rehearsed indifference, their voices low, smiles tight. Leora Wren entered with the same quiet confidence she carried into every room. Her navy blazer was pressed, heel steady, tablet tucked beneath her arm. She wasn't new. She wasn't loud. She was just black, and that made her presence feel unexpected to some, inconvenient to others. She scanned the room and noticed immediately 12 chairs around the table, 11 identical, one distinctly lower. It sat to the left of Elwood Greer, the VP of People and Culture. She took it without a word. Elwood, pale and meticulously dressed, began the meeting with his usual cadence, sharp and charming, his eyes darting over everyone but never quite landing on her. As the team reviewed quarterly projections, Leora pointed out a miscalculation in the ROI forecast. Calm, direct, backed by evidence. She didn't raise her voice, didn't push. But the moment she spoke, Elwood leaned back and chuckled, not kindly. He turned to the room and said some people still needed to learn that confidence wasn't the same as competence. The words weren't addressed to her, but they didn't have to be. Silence followed. One man cleared his throat. No one else spoke. Leora's hands stayed folded. The screen kept glowing. The meeting moved on. The next morning, the short chair was still there. Same spot. Same insult. No one said a thing. Elwood looked up from his notes, just long enough to meet her gaze, and then moved on. By now it was intentional. She knew it. Everyone knew it. But she smiled, took her seat again, and listened as the meeting unfolded without her name being mentioned once. When it ended, she stood to leave, only to be stopped in the hall by Harris from client accounts. His voice was soft, apologetic. Elwood wanted her to revise the pitch for the Dextra proposal. Something about her tone being too sharp. Something about needing to soften the message to fit the client's expectations. She nodded, said thank you, and returned to her desk. That deck had been signed off days ago. This wasn't about tone. This was about erasure. That afternoon, Elwood walked by her office without knocking, leaned in, and said they'd be realigning project leads next quarter. He didn't elaborate. She didn't ask. That was the dance. Speak less, do more, never show they're getting to you. By week's end, her inbox was filled with vague requests, unacknowledged contributions, and meeting invites where her role was listed as observer, not contributor. At lunch, she overheard two interns in the break room laughing about how Elwood said she was too intense to manage a room. She smiled as she passed them, pretending she hadn't heard. But she had. Every word. Monday brought the next humiliation. The client she'd cultivated for 9 months had been reassigned. No reason given. Just a forwarded message with her name replaced by a junior analyst who hadn't even finished onboarding. When she entered the weekly sync, the short chair was gone, replaced by a folding one. Elwood opened the meeting with a story about leadership requiring humility. His eyes found hers for the first time in days. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't clever. But it was effective. She was being downsized in every way that didn't require paperwork. Leora took her usual seat near the back, not by choice, but by routine, her notepad open, pen resting across the page, though she'd long since learned that most of what was said in these meetings wasn't meant for her to write down. Across the room, department heads bantered quietly over performance graphs, while Elwood stood at the front, sleeves rolled neatly, posture relaxed, his practiced charisma on full display. He gestured to a slide listing recent hires, a tableau of headshots organized by department. As he scanned the room, his smile sharpened. "Diversity," he said, letting the word hang. "It's more than a number, folks. It's a commitment. And let's be honest, it's also been great for our image this quarter." A few chuckles rippled across the room. He advanced to the next slide without looking at Leora. "We've made strides," he continued, "though in some cases, well, we've filled boxes, not gaps." He smiled, satisfied with the phrasing, and waited just long enough for the implication to settle. Leora sat perfectly still. Her breath was slow, controlled. Her fingers curled under the edge of the table as a surge of heat rose behind her eyes. She didn't blink. She didn't move. But she knew. Later that afternoon, as she reviewed vendor contracts at her desk, an email pinged in her inbox. Subject line: Talent Allocation Notes from Leadership Sync. It was marked internal only, and the sender was Elwood's assistant. A quick scan revealed it wasn't meant for her. It had been forwarded by mistake. She hesitated for only a second before reading. Inside were bullet points from a private conversation between senior leaders. One line, nested under a section titled Retention Risks, stood out like a crack in a wall. Ren remains politically sensitive, protected status hire. Unlikely to escalate, but best to isolate from client-facing roles for now. Quota optics achieved. Leora sat back in her chair, pulse hammering beneath her skin. Her vision blurred slightly, the words swimming across the screen like something unreal. Quota optics achieved. Protected status higher. Isolate. She closed the email and stared at the screen for a long time, the cursor blinking in the corner of a blank message draft she never sent. That night she couldn't sleep. The city outside her apartment buzzed with the usual white noise of traffic and sirens, but inside her chest was a different kind of noise, a rising static that wouldn't settle. She turned the phrase over and over in her mind like a stone she couldn't drop. Quota higher. It was confirmation of what they thought. Not what they said in public, but what they believed in private. It explained the meetings she wasn't invited to, the feedback she never received, the way Harris had stopped making eye contact, the short chair, the silence. The next morning, the office felt colder. Not physically, just in the way people passed her without pausing, the way conversations hushed slightly when she walked by. She opened her laptop and saw another meeting invite from Elwood. Strategic Realignment Review. No context, no prep. She accepted, knowing better than to refuse. At 2 p.m., she entered the small conference room where Elwood sat waiting with a cup of coffee and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He said they needed to rethink her placement in the upcoming product campaign due to fit concerns. When she asked what that meant, he spoke vaguely about alignment and audience resonance. His words were smooth, detached, well-rehearsed. He didn't mention the email. Neither did she. Instead, she left the room with her jaw locked, heart pounding. She returned to her desk and pulled up the product campaign folder she had spent weeks building. Every slide, every insight, every market breakdown. She copied the entire file to her personal drive, then closed her laptop with a soft click. Across the floor, a group of colleagues gathered near the coffee bar, laughing at something someone had said. One of them, a marketing manager named Paige, glanced her way and quickly turned back. Leora turned too and walked straight to the elevator. By Wednesday, word had spread that she'd been removed from the client briefings. No one said it aloud. No one had to. It showed in the meeting invites she no longer received, the Slack channels she was quietly removed from. Her role was being erased from the inside out. When Friday came, Elwood sent a company-wide message praising the inclusive work culture they'd cultivated, spotlighting recent hires and partnerships with diversity organizations. Leora read it twice, then deleted it. At first, she checked her settings, assuming there had been a glitch in the system. But there was no error. She had simply been cut out, removed from a flow of information like an expired variable in a formula. Her title remained the same, but her function had quietly evaporated. She wasn't invisible. She was being erased. On Tuesday morning, a message from Elwood's assistant arrived, brief and cool. It reminded her of an internal deadline for the very project she'd been locked out of. The email included a subtle warning. Elwood would be expecting a progress update in the next leadership sync. Leora stared at the message, her pulse tightening in her wrists. She walked down the hall toward Elwood's office, rehearsing how to ask a question that wouldn't sound like an accusation. But when she arrived, the door was closed and the glass wall offered a clear view. Elwood was inside with Paige and another manager, pointing at a screen and laughing, completely at ease. Leora stood there for a few seconds before turning away. She returned to her desk and opened the shared folder, once a living archive of ideas, strategy decks, internal notes. Now it was stripped bare. She tried searching for files by name. Nothing came up. She typed the project code into the server. Still nothing. Her access had been revoked. It wasn't just a removal from meetings. It was a lockout. When she emailed the file coordinator for clarity, the response was short. "You're not listed as an authorized contributor for this sprint." Leora closed her laptop and stared out the window. The city pulsed below her, full of motion and certainty, while she sat suspended in stillness, stripped of purpose by a man who had never once said her name with respect. By Thursday, Elwood called her into his office. His voice was calm, practiced. He asked why her deliverables hadn't been submitted. He asked why her name hadn't appeared in recent status reports. He asked why her team felt confused about her availability. Leora tried to respond with precision, noting the lack of access and exclusion from communications. Elwood nodded with mock concern, then pulled out a printed memo. It was a formal notice. He said it wasn't punitive, just procedural. But she would need to write a self-assessment. He called it a reflection, a chance to evaluate her approach to team engagement. A gentle redirection, he said. Just something to keep on file. Leora sat across from him, spine straight, watching him smile like a man dispensing wisdom. She knew the game. A paper trail. The beginning of justification. She left without speaking and returned to her office, where she found a junior employee standing awkwardly just inside her door. He looked startled, embarrassed even, holding his phone awkwardly. When she asked if he needed something, he mumbled something about a desk audit, then backed out. Leora watched him go, the discomfort on his face clearer than his excuse. Her desk was clean, organized, sterile. But in the hands of the right manipulator, a single photo could be framed however they wanted. That evening, she drafted the self-assessment. Every word was calculated. She did not admit fault. She did not point fingers. She simply outlined the breakdown of communication and the limitations placed on her access. She added timelines, references, and file paths. She knew it wouldn't matter, but she needed it on record. When she submitted it, she copied herself, blind copied legal, and stored a version in her private archive. This was no longer about the job. It was about the narrative, and Elwood was already rewriting it. By the end of the week, whispers moved through the office like currents. People asked if Leora had been demoted. Someone claimed she'd missed key deadlines. Another said she'd been spoken to by HR about behavior. None of it was true, but all of it spread. Leora said nothing. Her workday became a ritual of silence, showing up, logging in, delivering what she could with the limited information she had. She didn't ask for clarification. She didn't press for access. She watched and listened. One afternoon, Paige stopped her in the hallway, offering a quick smile that was more apology than greeting. She said something about a shared report and asked if Leora wanted to collaborate on a revised draft. Leora knew it wasn't real outreach. It was damage control. She thanked her politely and declined. Later that day, Elwood sent an email to the senior team, highlighting the importance of accountability at every level. He didn't mention Leora by name. He didn't have to. The implication was threaded through every line. Now, as she sat with her performance metrics neatly organized in a folder on her lap, he appeared perfectly at ease. scrolling through her file, with a faint smirk tugging at one corner of his mouth. He tapped at his tablet and offered a slow nod, then leaned back and crossed one ankle over the other, his tone friendly, his words anything but. He told her that while her numbers were technically above expectations, feedback about her attitude had raised concerns. He didn't specify whose feedback, nor did he elaborate on what attitude meant, but the message was clear. Leora had made herself visible in the wrong way. He gestured toward the file and said they were prepared to offer her a modest salary adjustment. Not a raise, not a recognition, just enough to appear reasonable. Then, without warning, his expression shifted into something sharper, something smug. He added that in environments like theirs, professionalism wasn't just about results. It was about tone, posture, grace. He said that sometimes the most strategic thing a person could do was to know when to speak, and more importantly, when to stay silent. He smiled as he said it, like a father delivering a lesson. And then he leaned in and said, almost conversationally, that smiles went further than sharp replies. That charm would carry her further than conviction ever would. Leora didn't react. Her shoulders remained square, her hands folded in her lap, her jaw set. She said nothing. She took the printed offer letter, nodded once, and left the room without a sound. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, not because of the paper inside, but because of what it meant. It wasn't a contract, it was a warning. She returned to her office, sat down at her desk, and stared at the offer, still sealed. Outside her glass walls, people moved like nothing had happened. A marketing analyst laughed too loudly at someone's joke. A senior designer high-fived his teammate. The world spun on, blind to the insult that had just been handed to her under the pretense of negotiation. That same afternoon, a new associate named Caleb stopped by her desk, nervously clutching a report she'd reviewed last week. He fumbled with his words as he thanked her for the notes, but his eyes darted to the floor and back again, as though unsure whether he should be standing there at all. When she asked if something was wrong, he hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said he had overheard Elwood earlier that morning during a team huddle. Elwood had been speaking casually to a small group of junior employees, offering unsolicited advice about navigating company culture. He'd said that some people came into these environments with chips on their shoulders, always ready to see injustice where none existed. He'd said that some hires were made to fulfill appearances, not potential. And then he'd looked across the floor toward her office and said, "Be careful who you align with. Some people wear victimhood like a badge. That kind of noise will bury your career before it starts." Caleb looked ashamed as he repeated the words. He said he didn't agree. He said it didn't seem right. But he also said he needed to keep his job. Leora thanked him and watched him walk away. She sat in silence for nearly an hour, replaying the encounter in her mind. It wasn't just that Elwood was attacking her performance or her competence. He was attacking her identity, her presence, the very fact that she was there. And now he was trying to isolate her even further by poisoning her reputation among those too new or too fearful to know better. She could feel it happening, like a slow tightening of a noose that no one else could see. The other employees still smiled when they passed her, but their eyes had changed. Warier, more calculated. Her name had become a signal, a cautionary tale. By Friday, her exclusion was complete. Her name no longer appeared on strategy decks. Her image had been removed from the internal project portal. Even the executive assistant who once smiled in the elevator now avoided eye contact. Leora worked her hours, completed her reports, and attended every meeting she was still invited to, though most of them now ended with vague thanks and no follow-up. She had become a shadow, present, silent, and slowly erased. That weekend, she sat at her kitchen table with the unopened offer letter still in front of her. She poured herself a drink and stared at the envelope, the edges frayed slightly from being handled too often. It wasn't the money that angered her. It was the message that if she wanted to succeed, she had to shrink, that she had to be smaller, quieter, more pliant, that she had to smile when she was insulted and thank them when she was ignored. She had always known the rules were different for her, but now they weren't just different. They were cruel. Elwood wasn't interested in leading. He was interested in control. And this raise, this insult disguised as reward, was proof. The next blow came wrapped in formality, masked as performance feedback. It arrived in the form of a quarterly evaluation document circulated to the senior leadership team. A document Leora was not supposed to see, but one that, thanks to a sympathetic assistant in operations, found its way to her inbox late on a Thursday night. The file contained assessment notes for all department heads across multiple teams. Most were standard, predictable, solid metrics, development goals, leadership highlights. Then came her section. It was brief, sterile, scathing. Her score, the lowest in her group, was justified by vague terms. Lacks adaptability under pressure, difficulty integrating with team culture, limited interpersonal fluency. At the bottom, in a small italicized note labeled confidential internal only, Elwood had written, continues to underperform in soft skill areas. May not be suited for client-facing leadership due to unresolved behavioral friction. Consider long-term transition into support role. Leora read it twice, her stomach tightening with each line. Behavioral friction. Underperform. Not suited. It wasn't just a critique. It was sabotage. The next day, news broke across the company that Revell Corporation had entered negotiations with a multinational energy firm. A deal valued at nearly $2 billion, the largest partnership in the company's history. The internal memo highlighted the opportunity for global expansion and emphasized the need for strong, consistent leadership to guide the strategy team. Leora had been working behind the scenes on early feasibility studies for that very project, compiling the financial models and preparing the risk frameworks months before the announcement. She knew the numbers better than anyone. She knew the angles. She had already drafted the brief for the onboarding package. And yet, when the project's official leadership team was announced during the all-hands meeting, her name was nowhere on it. Instead, Elwood introduced a new face, Elliot Klein, a recent MBA graduate brought on as part of a corporate internship program. He had been with the company for 7 weeks. He had shadowed one pitch call. He had never worked internationally. Elwood presented Elliot to the company as a fresh perspective, someone whose neutral image and global relatability made him uniquely suited to represent Revell in an international partnership. Leora sat at her desk, watching the live stream on her monitor. Her expression didn't change. Her posture didn't shift. But inside, something fractured. Not from shock, she wasn't surprised, but from the weight of what she had just seen confirmed in real time. Her value had been buried, repackaged, and handed off to someone who had done nothing to earn it except be the right color, the right gender, the right shape of comfort for executives who feared the unfamiliar. The fallout came quickly. Her inbox, once filled with approvals and updates, now held only meeting notes and irrelevant threads. Her name was removed from the risk report. Her edits to the forecast model were overwritten without explanation. When she emailed Elliot to clarify a discrepancy in the projected expense timeline, he responded with a cheerful thanks. I'll have someone look into it, and copied Elwood, who replied with a curt redirect future inquiries through the global strategy liaison. That liaison, as it turned out, was a junior associate who had joined the team 2 weeks ago, and who now held access to every folder Leora had built from scratch. She no longer had edit rights. She couldn't even comment. She had been walled off, rendered silent in her own work. Around the office, the shift became obvious. Colleagues who once casually stopped by her desk now diverted their paths. Conversations in break rooms stopped when she entered. Even Harris, who had once tried to warn her gently, now avoided her completely. The new narrative was settling in. Leora had been passed over, therefore she must have deserved it. And no one wanted to be associated with the fallout. She was being positioned as an example of what happens when someone like her reaches too far, speaks too confidently, resists too publicly. On Friday afternoon, as the office celebrated the partnership with catered lunch and champagne in the lounge, Leora sat alone in the small privacy booth off the main hallway. She sipped coffee gone cold and stared at the list of accounts she had been removed from. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She calculated. This wasn't just exclusion anymore. It was character assassination, and it had been planned. The performance review had been falsified to create a record. The leadership exclusion had been spun as optics. Every move Elwood made was strategic, deliberate, rehearsed. And the deeper she looked, the more she saw the same pattern in other departments. People marginalized, reassigned, slowly pushed out. It wasn't always about race. But when it was unmistakable. Leora stood by the elevator entrance, clutching a clipboard that had been handed to her 15 minutes earlier with no explanation, no context, just a list of guest names and a quiet directive from Elwood's assistant. You're on welcoming duty. She hadn't been invited to the planning meetings. She hadn't been given a speaking role, a presentation slot, or even a reserved seat. Instead, she had been positioned near the glass wall that looked out over the city, facing the crowd, but firmly outside of it. She scanned the list, recognized several names, CEOs, investors, politicians. But her own name was nowhere in the folder of assigned lanyards. There was no placard with her title, no identifier, no recognition. As guests began to arrive, dressed in tuxedos and silk gowns, she greeted them calmly, clearly, with a composure she had been forced to master. Some shook her hand. Others didn't look at her at all. Elwood passed by once, smiling broadly, clasping the shoulder of a board member as they toasted to a new era. He didn't acknowledge her presence. A few minutes later, he returned. He stepped close, voice low, and laced with the condescension he no longer bothered to hide. He gestured toward the reception desk beside the floral arrangements and said it would feel more natural if she stood behind it, where guests could approach her comfortably. He said optics mattered. He said approachability was a subtle art. He said guests didn't always respond well to energy that felt overly assertive at first glance. Leora met his gaze without blinking. Then, without a word, she stepped behind the desk. The rest of the evening passed like a hallucination. She stood in place, still and composed, while interns rushed past with wine trays, while Elliot laughed too loudly at jokes he didn't understand, while executives clapped one another on the back and exchanged business cards. The CEO gave a speech. Elwood smiled in every photo. The name Leora was not spoken once. She wasn't expected to mingle. She wasn't permitted to engage. When a guest from the London delegation asked her what she did at the company, she answered plainly, "I built the risk architecture for this deal." The man blinked, looked confused, then turned to Elwood, who had just appeared behind her. Elwood placed a hand on the guest's arm and said, "She helped with some documentation. Good with spreadsheets." The man nodded politely. Leora said nothing. Later that night, after the crowd had thinned and the laughter had faded into the soft lull of instrumental jazz, Elwood approached her one last time. His tie was loose, the corners of his mouth stained with wine. He leaned in slightly, tone playful, expression hollow. He said she had done a good job tonight. He said she had held her place well. He said not everyone was meant to lead, but the company always had room for people who knew how to support. Then he said something quieter, something just for her. He said, "You're lucky to be here, Leora. People like you shouldn't take that for granted." She didn't move. She didn't speak. She only stared at him until he finally walked away. When the room emptied, she gathered her things and made her way toward the elevators. The building was silent now, the celebration reduced to empty glasses and discarded programs. She paused at the door, glanced once more at the space where her name should have been printed on a banner, where her voice should have been heard through the speakers. Then she stepped inside, the doors closing behind her like the curtain at the end of a cruel play. In her apartment that night, she didn't cry. She didn't write. She didn't replay the conversation. She simply sat in silence, the same silence Elwood had assigned to her since the day she arrived. Only this time, she sat in control of it. Leora walked through the building without hesitation, her steps measured, her posture calm. The ID badge clipped discreetly to her coat pocket, bearing no corporate title. Only a small gold emblem few in the building would recognize. She moved past the reception desk where she'd been stationed just days earlier, past the marble elevators, past the hallways that had once whispered her erasure, and into the private executive lounge where breakfast had been arranged for the incoming delegation. Elwood was already there, flanked by legal counsel, 2 brand leads, and Elliot, who hovered with the nervous energy of a man out of depth but determined to pretend otherwise. The room hummed with polite laughter and forced charm. Elwood's voice rang out with theatrical welcome as he turned toward the tall man entering from the far doors, Julian Marchand, chair of Aegis International Holdings, the entity with whom the billion-dollar partnership had been signed. Cameras flashed. Applause scattered awkwardly across the room. Elwood stepped forward, arms outstretched, ready to make his grand introduction. But Julian did not stop to greet him. Instead, he scanned the room once, then twice, until his eyes landed on the far left corner, where Leora stood near the paneled windows. With a smile that erased every other sound in the room, he strode across the marble floor and extended both arms. "Leora," he said in that warm, lilting cadence shaped by years in Geneva and Seoul. "My friend, you look well." Every head turned in unison. Elwood's smile faltered. Elliot blinked. Paige, standing by the espresso cart, froze with a porcelain cup halfway to her mouth. Leora returned Julian's greeting without fanfare, her voice low but clear as she accepted his handshake. He asked if she was ready. She nodded once. "They don't know," he asked quietly. She said, "Not yet." Then he laughed, not cruelly, but as one laughs when witnessing a moment of inevitable correction. Julian turned to the crowd, raised one hand and said, "I'd like to invite the person most responsible for this partnership's vision to say a few words." Elwood stepped forward instinctively, but Julian's arm cut across him. "Not you," he said. "Her." He gestured to Leora. "Ms. Wren." Gasps didn't echo aloud, but they trembled in throats. Leora stepped into the center of the room, and the silence that followed was not one of respect, but of reckoning. She stood with the stillness of someone who had waited her entire life to be seen, but had never begged for it. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "For the past 6 months, I've been leading the compliance and capital alignment strategy for this expansion," she said. "Not on behalf of Revell, but in partnership with Aegis. As of last quarter, I joined the board of Aegis International as a voting member, overseeing North American allocations." She paused. No one moved. "I also signed off on the final personnel due diligence reports for this partnership." Her eyes scanned the room. They stopped on Elwood, including leadership profiles, internal risk assessments, and cultural alignment metrics. She let the words sink in. Then she added, without a flicker of emotion, "Several decisions were flagged." That was all she said. She didn't need to say more. The room stood still, like the moment before a tidal wave touches shore. Elwood took a breath, opened his mouth, then closed it again. His face, once so composed, now flushed at the edges with something between disbelief and fear. He looked at Julian, then at the board members who had begun to whisper in pairs, their expressions shifting from celebration to calculation. Paige stepped back quietly. Elliot moved toward the door. Leora didn't flinch. Julian turned to the crowd and thanked them all for attending, then said that revised partnership terms would be discussed in closed session. He said certain personnel questions would be handled swiftly. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. The message had landed like stone. As the room emptied, no one approached Leora. No one offered apologies. No one dared to pretend they hadn't participated in what she had endured. She didn't demand their attention. She didn't seek their shame. She simply stood and watched as the floor cleared, as the cameras powered down, as Elwood's voice was reduced to a whisper behind a glass door. In the hallway, a young intern passed her with a stack of folders. He stopped, stammered a greeting, and then said, "I didn't know." "I'm sorry." Leora looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "Now you do." Rumors rippled through the halls, tense and breathless, bouncing off polished walls and past blank stares. The summit had ended less than 24 hours earlier, but the ripple effect had begun its march through the hierarchy with the force of a silent avalanche. Leora had not returned to her office. She had not checked her company inbox. She had not answered any calls. But every major decision that morning bore her fingerprint. Inside the boardroom, where the windows reflected the cold slate-gray sky, Elwood sat rigid, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the room for familiar allies who now avoided his gaze. The CEO sat opposite him, a man once confident in Elwood's results, now surrounded by legal counsel and visibly unsettled. Julian Marchand had not returned to Geneva as scheduled. He was seated in the room as well, composed but utterly unreadable. Before anyone spoke, the door opened, and Leora entered, calm and poised, a thin black folder in her hand. No one greeted her. No one dared. She took the seat nearest to the CEO, placed the folder on the table, and opened it without a word. The room held its breath. She withdrew a single sheet of paper, a signed transcript, then slid it forward. Next came a small audio device, which she placed precisely at the center of the table. She pressed play. For a few seconds, there was only static. Then Elwood's voice emerged unmistakable, captured in a moment he had never meant anyone outside his trusted circle to hear. His tone was relaxed, his cadence familiar, the kind of voice used behind closed doors, where arrogance feels safe and impunity feels earned. "It's not about qualifications," he said. "It's about message control. You put someone like her, black, loud, opinionated, in a leadership role, and suddenly the whole culture shifts. And not in a direction anyone wants. You think the board's ready to watch a woman like that steer this company? I'm not. Not ever." The room went silent again, this time with a weight that could be felt in the chest. The CEO didn't look at Elwood. He stared at the audio device, as if hoping it would vanish. Julian leaned forward, folding his hands together. Then he said calmly, "That recording was time-stamped 6 weeks ago, during the initial stage of joint venture negotiations. Is that correct?" Leora nodded. "I received it anonymously," she said, "but I verified the metadata and the source. No one asked who the whistleblower was. No one needed to. The message stood on its own. What followed was a blur of formalities, statements read into record, legal review processes invoked, immediate suspension issued." The CEO attempted to recover composure, stating that a full internal review would be launched. Julian interrupted. "There will be no further negotiations with your team as it stands," he said, "until every member of senior leadership named in this file is removed from decision-making authority. Aegis will place the deal on hold. Indefinitely." His voice was soft. His meaning was absolute. Elwood tried to speak. He claimed the context was misunderstood. He claimed it was banter. He claimed it was never intended to reflect corporate policy. But the words were too late, too public, too permanent. The weight of his own voice, played back in a room he once controlled, now dragged him under. Leora said nothing more. She rose from her chair and left the folder behind. Inside it were memos, meeting logs, calendar entries, each one tethered to the pattern she had tracked over the last 10 months. They weren't just allegations. They were architecture. A map of how bigotry hides inside process. A record of how discrimination is disguised as culture fit. As she walked down the hall, passing the glass offices that had once symbolized power, the very foundation of the building felt different beneath her shoes. There was no applause, no vindication speech, only the quiet unraveling of a system that had long relied on silence. Behind her, the executive room fell into disarray, voices rising, reputations collapsing, deals dissolving with every new question. She didn't look back. There was nothing left to prove. She had exposed the truth not through confrontation, but through calculation. And now, the truth would do what it was always meant to do: level the ground beneath those who had thought themselves untouchable. Within 24 hours of the recording's release, the board of directors had voted unanimously to terminate his employment for cause, citing not only the recorded comments, but the pattern of misconduct laid bare in Leora's documentation. His removal wasn't announced with ceremony. It was processed like a clinical extraction, swift and bloodless. But the tremor it sent through the upper floors of the company was unmistakable. Department heads whispered over their laptops, avoiding eye contact with anyone they once considered allies. Executive assistants exchanged glances when HR began collecting office keys and laptops behind closed doors. By noon, Elwood's name had vanished from the building's internal Slack channels, and his face, once prominently displayed in the leadership spotlight wall by the main entrance, was removed and replaced by an empty frame. But his punishment extended far beyond the company walls. By the end of the week, multiple business journals ran headlines detailing the internal scandal at Revell Corporation, citing anonymous sources, linking statements from the summit, and referencing the audio file that had now circulated through investor channels. The term ethics breach appeared alongside Elwood's name across every major financial database. Recruitment firms withdrew contracts. Venture partners suspended communications. And a quiet but unmistakable notice appeared in the industry's premier executive registry, subject flagged for conduct review. In less than 72 hours, Elwood's reputation, once curated with precision, collapsed under the weight of his own voice. His planned keynote appearance at a global HR innovation forum was canceled without refund. A media outlet published a profile listing prior employees who had lodged informal complaints against him in years past, most of which had never seen follow-up. But now, with the spotlight sharpened, those stories were being retold. One former analyst recalled being told to stay in her lane after requesting leadership mentorship. Another claimed she was demoted after refusing to attend after-hours events Elwood hosted for culture building. One of his former assistants, emboldened by the current reckoning, submitted a detailed statement to HR outlining years of manipulative conduct, targeted exclusion, and racial microaggressions disguised as coaching. Internally, a new investigation committee was formed under legal oversight. Its task was not merely to examine Elwood's behavior, but to map the structure that allowed it to thrive. They uncovered emails where promotions were blocked without cause, recommendations buried, and feedback rewritten before being submitted to performance files. Elwood's digital signature appeared in documents that redirected credit from junior staff to handpicked favorites. In one flag case, a black employee's project was intentionally delayed so a peer could present the idea first. Dozens of files confirmed a systemic pattern: erasure, marginalization, and narrative manipulation. The evidence didn't just implicate Elwood. It implicated those who had supported him in silence. Several senior managers were asked to resign quietly. A handful chose to push back, claiming ignorance or deflecting blame. But the paper trail refuted them. A week after Elwood's termination, 5 more executives were released from their contracts. No farewell emails were circulated. No exit interviews were conducted. They were removed not for optics, but for complicity. Leora watched it unfold from a distance. She didn't speak to the press. She didn't update her professional profile. She didn't attend the emergency meetings the board now scrambled to host. She had said what needed to be said. Now, it was the system's turn to answer for itself. In private, several employees reached out. Messages came through encrypted lines, quietly expressing support, gratitude, even apologies. One simply read, "You were right. I should have stood up when it mattered." Another said, "Thank you for doing what the rest of us were too afraid to." She read them all. She replied to none. It wasn't silence out of bitterness. It was clarity. The truth didn't require applause. It required consequence. Meanwhile, Aegis International reaffirmed its position. They released a public statement acknowledging Leora's role in protecting ethical standards and confirmed the full pause of a joint partnership until Revell could demonstrate long-term cultural restructuring. They noted that any future contract would be contingent on external auditing and the installation of a new leadership framework rooted in equity and accountability. Internally, this meant sweeping policy overhauls, anonymous reporting systems, protected channels for underrepresented employees, and leadership review processes that no longer relied solely on peer recommendation. The changes didn't happen overnight, but they started. Elwood, once the gatekeeper of advancement at Revell, was now the cautionary tale. A man who rose through fear and influence only to be undone by a voice memo and a woman he believed he had buried. His attempts to recover in the press failed. His statement of regret, filled with corporate jargon and vague appeals to changing times, was met with widespread skepticism. Months passed, and the noise around Revell began to settle into something quieter, something deeper. The firm underwent an aggressive restructuring process, publicly audited, externally reviewed, and reshaped under new leadership policies meant to foster transparency, equity, and accountability. Hiring practices changed. Language changed. Rooms that once echoed with exclusion were now being repainted, not just cosmetically, but structurally. Diversity councils were no longer symbolic. Employee feedback no longer disappeared into empty mailboxes. And in this rebuilding phase, one name resurfaced unexpectedly, not as a villain to be condemned further, but as a figure beginning the long and uneasy path of accountability: Harper. Though she had not been as publicly exposed as Elwood, her role in sustaining the culture of exclusion had been noted, documented, and addressed through internal counsel. She had resigned quietly during the second wave of departures following the investigation. Her name, once whispered behind doors for orchestrating whisper campaigns and passive sabotage, faded from corporate spaces but did not vanish from consequence. She reemerged 6 months later, not through a defensive statement or a self-serving essay, but through an open forum panel discussion hosted by an independent social justice media organization. The event theme, Turning Inward, Corporate Accountability Beyond Public Apology, featured a mix of former executives, culture critics, and grassroots organizers. Harper sat at the far right of the stage, her posture tense but composed, her voice steady despite the weight it carried. She didn't blame anyone. She didn't deny what had happened. Instead, she spoke plainly. She said, "I spent years believing I earned my success because I followed the rules. I climbed the ladder. I made the right moves. And somewhere along the way, I began to believe those moves made me better than the people left behind." She paused, then added, "But what I didn't realize was that those rules weren't written for everyone. And I used them not just to climb, but to push others down." She went on to describe the implicit messages she absorbed early in her life: ideas about control, assimilation, the fear of difference disguised as professionalism. She confessed to her own moments of silent complicity and, worse, active contribution to workplace hostility. "I didn't call it racism at the time," she said. "I called it standards. I called it fit. I called it readiness. But that was a lie I told myself to feel clean." The audience was still. No applause interrupted her words. No validation softened their edges. She wasn't there for redemption. She wasn't asking for a second chance. She was doing something rarer, offering a map back from harm, not for herself, but for those who still occupied the roles she once held. After the panel, Harper disappeared from the media cycle once more, but not from action. She registered a non-profit organization based out of a modest office in Newark, Framework Reset. Its mission was direct: to retrain mid-level and senior corporate managers on racial humility, inclusive leadership, and harm-aware decision-making. No flashy campaigns, no sponsorships, just workshops, peer dialogues, and long, uncomfortable conversations that didn't end after one afternoon. The first attendees were managers from regional banks, logistics companies, and healthcare systems. Later came firms from the tech sector, who had followed Ravel's scandal with quiet anxiety. Harper didn't front the sessions. She sat in them, observed, coordinated, ensured that those with lived experience led the conversation. Her name no longer appeared in front-facing material, but her presence, now reflective and grounded, made the space real. 1 year later, a mid-sized firm published an internal memo praising Framework Reset for transforming departmental cohesion through honest reflection. The line wasn't headline-worthy, but it was the kind of impact Harper now lived for: quiet repair, seeded slowly. She didn't expect forgiveness from people like Leora. She didn't chase acknowledgement. What she carried now was not reputation, but responsibility. The weight was different, heavier, but more human. Leora, for her part, never crossed paths with Harper again. She had returned to global consulting, her voice now amplified in boardrooms across industries, seeking to rebuild what they once ignored. She spoke not of revenge, but of recalibration. She mentored young professionals who reminded her of who she once was: quiet, observant, brilliant, and waiting for someone to see them. In a keynote in London, When asked how she felt watching her former company unravel, Leora responded with the kind of clarity that silenced rooms. It didn't unravel. It was revealed. And what we reveal, we can finally rebuild. And so, the story settled not in fury, but in growth. Not in shame, but in confrontation. Those who had participated in harm, through silence, pride, or fear, found their paths divided. Some disappeared into obscurity. Others changed nothing. But a few, like Harper, chose the difficult path of learning not to be seen as right, but to become better. In a system built to preserve its own comfort, the smallest act of change is to admit you were wrong, and then refuse to stay that way. The end did not come as fire or applause. It came quietly, through small doors, through new conversations, through names no longer erased, and through justice that didn't roar, but stayed. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss another powerful journey like this one. What part of Leora's experience hit you the hardest? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective.